Why are there so few games that let you play as the villain? Now, I know there's a small bargain bin of games that feature less than cheery or morally ambiguous protagonists. The Last of Us, the first 3 games of the Far Cry series, Uncharted, yada yada. It's not unheard of for games to feature main characters who are not necessarily the squeakiest of the clean and clipped boy/girl scouts who so often patrol the front covers of video games these days. If anything, it's become far more common over the last decade or so, as games have matured and taken less of a nobody cares attitude to their narratives and more of a well-meaning Oscar bait approach. People love a good 3-dimensional character, and at this point it's become a source of contention for characters who are either exclusively good and kind and perfect in every conceivable way, or the diametric opposite. So much so that this common source of criticism wound up transforming Kratos from an incessantly angry god to an incessantly growly god on a snowy mountain with a bloody annoying child. But why are there so few games that just let you play a jolly good villain? For one thing, it's possible that it's down to a question of morality. What exactly are the moral implications of putting your average Joe into the shoes of a morally bankrupt lady or gentleman and letting them run riot upon a fictional world? Well, very few, to be perfectly frank. Gaming, just like the video nasties of the 70s and 80s, is no stranger to political scapegoating. Without being too transparent about the specifics, given that it's a discussion that's been beaten to death and isn't the point of this video, various tragedies throughout the 90s tended to find themselves with video games at the centre of their controversy. In some ways to find something to blame, but in others to allow the extreme conservatives to pick a fight with something that can't really fight back. Despite numerous studies debunking the claim, there continues to exist the moral panic of the impact of violent video games on individuals that is brought up every so often, and typically in response to a tragedy of some kind. This is an argument that's been going around in circles for 20 years, and no doubt will continue to pirouette for as long as it takes for mankind to find something else to blame for all of its problems. I do, of course, only speak for myself with this, but I can safely say that Doom doesn't make me want to travel to Mars and or Hell to curb stomp demons any more than Stardew Valley makes me want to become a farmer. So you might be wondering by this point, Jack, your video is titled after a TV show. What on earth does this have to do with gaming? Well, disembodied impatient voice, let me explain with a teeny tiny little bit of backstory on the good old United Kingdom's relationship with video games. In the entire history of gaming in the UK, only 5 video games have ever been banned. Of those 5, only 2 continue to be banned for sale. Rayplay, which is precisely as charming as it sounds, and the much more recent Omega Labyrinth Z. Just for a little context on how relaxed the BBFC is towards video games, prior to this year's Omega Labyrinth being banned back in March, the last video game to receive the ban hammer was Manhunt 2. Manhunt 2, which was released in 2008. To give you a further idea of how reprehensible something needs to be before it suffers a ban in the UK, the penultimate film to be banned here was The Human Centipede 2. The reason I've brought all this up so far is primarily down to laying the foundation bricks for the next few minutes worth of arguments. See, I've always wanted to play a game where you play as a villain who is horrifying, interesting, unique, and despite their terrible character flaws, utterly compelling. The whole purpose of games is to present a reality you can escape into, and yet there remains this one very specific fantasy, the ultimate escape, if you will, that is so rarely explored. But is it really fear over the potential for moral outrage, or is it something else entirely? I'm going to put forth the notion that the reason we don't see many video games where we get to play the villain is not because of the potential for moral outrage or the usual diatribe that surrounds these kinds of releases, but rather because it's simply too difficult to make a great game where you play the villain. That is to say that writing great villains is hard enough at the best of times, and the games industry of today simply doesn't want to take the risk, or even so much as dip a toe into the water. It is so much easier to root the player into the narrative when they already have a moral bond to their character. Since the average individual is a perfectly ordinary human and not a rampaging psychopath, the chances are that writing a shining paragon of a main character is going to hit the empathetic mark more often than it misses. I'd also like to suggest that the second biggest reason these kinds of video games are so rare is because of how difficult it is to make a villain in a video game not just interesting or compelling, but likeable to the extent that the audience actively roots for them. Not Not because video games aren't capable of doing this at all, but rather because of how constrained they are compared to films and television shows. There is a distinct lack of freedom when it comes to the narrative progression of video games that simply doesn't exist for certain other media, particularly books and serializations. We'll come to that one in a short while though. For now, let's take a little time to explore the namesake of this video. It's not uncommon for televised media to pitch the audience into the lives of morally dubious individuals and dare them to care for their plight. From America's Dexter and Breaking Bad to the UK's Peaky Blinders and Sherlock, fantastic writing can make even the most intolerable of individuals strangely likeable, even if our reaction to seeing such a person in real life would typically be a strong urge to put them behind bars. The blinders that fiction equips us with provides a safe haven from reality where we can sit in comfort and root for a bad guy without feeling guilty about it, especially when that's exactly what the show wants us to do. When an audience has no agency in a matter and is simply watching the drama unfold, a show can take its time to peel back the layers and unravel the mystery, providing more and more points of interest for us to sink our teeth into. Even if a character does something truly terrible, it's easy to convince ourselves that it's justified in some way or another. The person Dexter killed was far worse than he ever was, for example. He's just cleaning up the streets. Like Dexter himself posits during the series, it's only insofar as the public has no idea who he actually is that they are happy to let him continue. They enjoy the vigilantism, secretly root for him to continue his work. Deep down, they're happy somebody like him exists. But if they were to find out that Dexter himself was responsible, the facade that the television show's internal audience has built around themselves would crumble, because putting a name and a face to the hidden villainy means you have to bring it to justice. You can't just ignore it anymore. And in this regard, television has a unique ability to weave a complex narrative wherein the audience knows exactly who the bad guy is, but whether by situation or intrigue or simply tremendous writing, they feel naturally pushed to root for that villain. Or perhaps they want to root for the villain because they are simply too fascinating not to care for. Killing Eve is a collaborative effort between BBC and BBC America based on the 2018 Luke Jennings novel codenamed Villainy. Starring British actress Jodie Comer of Dr. Foster fame as a titular assassin and Canadian Sandra Oh of Grey's Anatomy as MI5 agent Eve Polastri, the show charts the increasing obsession between the two women as they track each other down with varying motivations. Before I continue, please be aware that this video is going to spoil the show. The whole thing, the entire series, including the ending. If you've not watched it, then I highly recommend you do so. Killing Eve is easily my favourite TV series of the year, showcasing some absolutely extraordinary talent from Jodie Comer, who, by the way, is younger than me, and it's not bloody fair. How are you so talented? Sorry. Anyway. Killing Eve was one of those shows that I kind of accidentally put off watching for a while, in part because I kept getting distracted by other things, but also because I'd heard so many good things about it that I was worried it wouldn't live up to the hype. Hell, am I glad I was wrong, because it is every bit as fantastic as I expected, and by the end of the series I was frustrated that I would have to wait for so long before I got to see the next stage of the story. Throughout the show, equal time is devoted to the MI5 agent Eve, the source of the assassin's obsession, and Villainy herself, but it is the latter that I want to focus on. The show currently has 8 episodes, and though we have been drip-fed information about Villainy, namely that she is extremely intelligent but emotionally unstable, was orphaned at a relatively young age and has a habit of obsessing over people who interest her, we still know very little about her. We have no idea what really motivates her, and that is at once both fascinating and terrifying. To kick off my argument, let me start with this. The biggest issue with being the anti-hero as opposed to just watching them on screens is the mystery of it all. Villainy works as a character and as someone we can root for because the information we don't have about her humanises her and grounds her in reality. We know she enjoys what she does, but we have no idea what made her the way that she is. We can see that she's intelligent, capable, and at times somewhat childish, and that only invests us more, whether that be with curiosity or fascination. But what truly serves her cause is the fantastic manner in which she is portrayed. Jodie Comer is one hell of an actress, and Killing Eve displays an extraordinary talent for such a relatively young, fresh actress. That psychopathic glint to her eye, the gentle vulnerability, the ease with which she drifts in and out of accents and languages. In unskilled hands, this character, and by extension this show, simply would not work. The weight of the entire series lies on the shoulders of Villanelle, and by God if she doesn't do an extraordinary job of keeping us invested, oftentimes just as hilarious as she is deadly. So what does this have to do with being the villain in video games? Well, the problem with playing a villain in a game is that the motivation is us and the game that we are playing. When agency is introduced to this medium, whether we're a good guy or a bad guy, the motivation is laid out for us from the off the majority of the time. Take some recent examples. Jonathan from Vampire wants to know who turned him into a monster. Kratos wants to avenge his family and destroy the Greek pantheon. Joel does terrible things first to make a living and then to protect Ellie. Though many of gaming's anti-heroes are not particularly pleasant people, many of them are still generally good people, driven to desperate or awful acts by tragedy or circumstance. Villanelle is most emphatically not a good person. She is a terrible person doing terrible things. Hell, the first thing we see her do in the show is spitefully shove a child's ice cream into her chest. Not because she needs to do it or because it serves any grander purpose, but because she wants to, because she can, because it's fun. That is our introduction to the character, and such a simple action tells us everything we need to know about her to invest us. She is someone who can act with such blatant disregard for secrecy, unabashedly eschewing the need to mask her deadly task, and we just have to know why. Who or what is protecting someone who is so barefaced with their murderous rampage? The problem with creating a story where the player just gets to be a bad guy is that this is so antithetical to the way that most humans function that the only way to ensure the player's attention and empathy is maintained is to introduce human elements, purpose and motivation. Okay, so I'm evil. Why? And that's not to say that Villanelle is fundamentally different. Sure, she is the show's central villain, but she is absolutely written to be a fun, likeable character whose ability to masterfully manipulate is at once both disturbing and entrancing, and that's fine because it's somebody else wreaking havoc. And on top of that, we are supposed to root for the villain. The interactions between Eve and Villanelle are tense, smartly written, witty, and practically ooze repressed sexual desire. The show is engineered to make us feel a range of emotions towards Villanelle, and this is portrayed as perfectly acceptable. It's just a show. We're not making her do those things, we're just watching her do them from the comfort of our couches. But when it is the player's active agency causing terrible things to happen, reconciling this with making it seem justified all but requires a humanised anti-hero, not an all-out villain. Otherwise you run the risk of alienating your audience, your predominantly normal, white-collar, blue-tie 9-to-5 Jane and John who've only ever thought about murdering their boss in humorous passing. A fact is that as humans we are predisposed towards seeking meaning in things, particularly patterns, but that's a whole other kettle of fish. But when it comes to justifying our own actions, the ability to rationalise and empathise can become a little waylaid, depending on the severity of our actions, hence the reason why conditions like Stockholm Syndrome exist. And this is exactly why Eve Pilastri reacts the way she does at the end of the show when she stabs Villanelle. She was so determined to kill the assassin that she'd rationalised away the implications of doing so, not just for her own morals but for her humanity as well. So when she actually stabs our anti-hero, the full horror of what she has done hits her, causing panic, horror and guilt. The back and forth of motivation in the show is one of its core tenets, the heart of the matter that we are most invested in as we try to unravel what it is that both Eve and Villanelle really want. More specifically for a moment, what does Eve herself truly desire? Was her reaction to stabbing Villanelle horror at the act itself and what she has resorted to, or because of who it was that she stabbed? Her use of Villanelle's own manipulative technique against her is fascinating in and of itself, because it's unclear as to whether this was deliberate, accidental, or just the natural progression of Eve's character development, whether she liked it or not. At what point did she commit to the act of stabbing Villanelle? When did she really convince herself that she could do it? The reaction is so real, you can tell that she has never stabbed anyone before, and perhaps it's the feel of the blade pushing through flesh that truly terrifies her. We don't know, we'll maybe never know, and that mystery is as fascinating and enticing as it is compelling. But you just can't have a story like this in a video game, it just isn't something that's possible, and this is entirely down to the fact that, of course, video games and television shows are constructed completely differently. and have their own unique ways of telling a story. When it comes to TV shows, we know what we're getting into. It doesn't matter if the show takes a detour to show us something that might seem irrelevant at the time, because we know it's more than likely going to be part of a grander picture. But if a game starts doing this, interrupting our active agency to show us something in an effort to make us care or invest us further, it's gonna cause a little grief. We have the possibility to lose our connection to our characters anytime we have zero agency in the events unfolding before us. Whenever we have to put the controller down for an extended period of time, it runs the risk of being either boring, annoying, or both, which, now that I think about it, is probably the entire reason why QuickTime events are so bloody ubiquitous these days. And this is something that games generally struggle with. The phrase ludonarrative dissonance, as needlessly tongue-twisting as it is, exists for a reason. Tomb Raider is the most oft-dragged-out example, but to be fair, it is a pretty good example. Oh, the horror, what have I become? Oh well, might as well kill everyone. It's difficult enough to have a compelling villain in a game, but when they become the protagonist and you have to start trying to reconcile this with the player's motivations, which could be as simple as, I just want to be a jerk, to, I want to see if I can redeem this villain, you're inevitably going to run into brick walls with somebody. And this is also part and parcel of why you'll tend to find that many modern RPGs let the player run riot within reason, but no one will really react or care to the degree that it actually affects the overall narrative. Probably because you're the chosen one, and those bloody arrow-kneed sweet-roll stealing Skyrim guards can't just, hire a new one. Probably. The thing is, part of the fascination with psychopaths comes from watching them, seeing how they work, understanding how and why they function the way that they do, but actually stepping into their shoes is generally uncomfortable, not fun. Turning that feeling into a game is going to be tough no matter what you do, no matter what the justification is for it, and there will always be the risk of it just becoming an exploitative medium, or at least being accused of it, just like Manhunt, Mad World, and so on. Just to harken back to what I mentioned right at the beginning of this video, it's worth repeating that only 5 games have ever been banned in the UK, and this is typically a result of extreme excessive violence with no real purpose or context, or explicit sexual content typically involving minors. It's interesting then that one of the games that has never been banned, nor was even temporarily refused classification until it was edited, like in many other countries, is Postal 2. Anyone familiar with Postal 2 is probably going to know exactly where I'm going with this. Anyone not familiar with this game who happens to have a delicate sensibility may wish to look away for about a minute or so. Postal 2 is a horrific, vile, offensive, disturbing, extremely grim, tirelessly aggressive, and hilarious game, if you play it that way. Undoubtedly, one of the reasons why Postal 2 was never banned here is because the violence, sexual content, and offensive religious stereotypes are in the game, sure, but they are all entirely optional. They're not even remotely necessary for the completion of the game, and this is where the BBFC draws the line. In Manhunt, you have to brutally murder people to progress the plot, but in Postal 2, your mission is, for example, to go to the shop and get some milk. What shenanigans you happen to get into on the way to that shop are entirely down to you, and if that happens to wind up with you in a gimp costume pissing on random bystanders, well, the game didn't make you do it. But it can all be rationalised away as the player's desire to engage in these unrelentingly psychopathic tendencies, because the option is there to do so, and if you don't want to, then you don't need to. The game can still be completed without any of the excessive violence or offensive stuff. Unsurprisingly, Postal 2 was not popular with the conservative press, though bizarrely it rarely ever seems to get mentioned whenever people drag video games through the dirt to scapegoat them. It's almost as if a game's potential to cause offence hinges on who plays it and how they play it. Weird. In the end though, what seems to prevent games with the degree of fascination and humanity that Killing Eve has from being made is not necessarily an unwillingness to try, but a fear of doing it wrong. The industry is becoming more and more cutthroat, and anything even remotely risky rarely reaches conceptual stages. The best developers for these kinds of experiences are naturally indie devs who aren't constrained by their corporate overlords, but that depends on how important graphical fidelity is to you. What I'm trying to say is that although video games are an escape from reality, specific escape conditions are very difficult to do well, and more importantly, to do right. We live in a world filled with bizarre fetishes and even stranger dirty dealings in the shadows, but these things tend to have the motivation and agency of an individual behind them, in a situation they have actively created and or engaged in, and have some measure of control over. Games are dependent on the creator's vision lining up with the player's desire. Any disconnect, whether it's glitches, dodgy controls, poor writing, whatever it happens to be, runs the risk of buggering up the escapism that the player has built around them. So, what's my solution to this? Go watch Killing Eve, because it's really fucking good, okay?
Dealt with.
Oh.